Have you ever wondered why the most celebrated city in America feels more and more like a place people pretend to love rather than a place they genuinely enjoy living in? This is the uncomfortable question almost no one dares to ask, because admitting the truth about New York feels like breaking an unspoken rule. But if you look closely, past the marketing slogans and the glamorous skyline, something far more fragile is happening beneath the surface. The illusion of an unstoppable metropolis is fading, and what remains is a city wrestling with problems too large to hide and too common to ignore. Walk through Midtown during rush hour and you will notice it instantly. The energy that once defined New York is no longer effortless. It is forced, strained, as if the city itself is trying to convince you it still has the same magnetic pull it once had. But behind the flashing billboards and polished storefronts lies a growing sense of exhaustion. Streets that used to flow with confidence now feel heavy, cluttered, and unstable. Crime has crept into areas that were once untouchable. Public behavior has shifted in ways longtime residents never imagined. The social contract that held millions together seems to be quietly dissolving, piece by piece. People still repeat the same old lines about New York being the center of the world, a global capital of culture and opportunity. But step outside the glossy narrative and a harsher reality comes into view. The city feels overwhelmed by a level of disorder that cannot be explained away as temporary. The constant noise does not hide the tension. The bright lights do not mask the frustration. New York today reveals a contradiction that is hard to reconcile. It is both iconic and fragile, powerful and deteriorating, admired and increasingly abandoned by those who have lived long enough to see the difference. The truth is that many who defend the city the loudest are also the ones who avoid confronting what it has become. They cling to nostalgia, insisting that everything is fine, that New York is just going through another cycle. Yet deep down, people sense the shift. Something fundamental has changed. What used to feel like controlled chaos now leans dangerously close to uncontrolled decline. And whether you are a resident, a visitor, or someone who has simply watched from afar, the signs are becoming too visible to ignore. Before we continue deeper into what is happening on the streets, in the neighborhoods, and inside the systems that once made this place extraordinary, let me ask you something. Have you ever experienced this side of New York yourself? If any of this resonates with what you have seen or felt, share your thoughts in the comments, because understanding this reality begins with honest conversations. And while you're here, make sure to like the video and check if you're already subscribed to the channel. What comes next will connect directly with everything we have uncovered so far, expanding the picture in ways that may shift how you see New York from this moment on. As you move deeper into the city, the shift becomes even more impossible to overlook. What once felt like the vibrant heartbeat of New York now feels like a pulse, struggling to keep rhythm. The streets themselves tell the story long before statistics or headlines do. Sidewalks that once carried the confidence of a global metropolis now carry a weight they were never meant to bear. Trash piles linger longer than they should. People navigate around clusters of individuals visibly battling mental health crises. The sense of shared responsibility that once defined the urban flow seems to have fractured, leaving behind an atmosphere where everyone moves quickly but no one feels safe. The simplest act of walking, once part of the city's charm, has quietly transformed into a daily negotiation. It is not just the overcrowded intersections or the endless construction zones. It is the unpredictable moments that make people tighten their grip on their bags, cross the street abruptly, or glance over their shoulders more than they used to. Even longtime residents admit that their routes have changed, not because the city expanded, but because it contracted into pockets where they feel less exposed. The idea of New York as a walkable sanctuary of culture, energy, and freedom now competes with the reality of erratic behavior, rising confrontations, and the unsettling feeling that the rules of public space have blurred. Look closely and you notice how the city's physical environment mirrors its emotional climate. Storefronts covered in graffiti sit next to luxury towers that try desperately to project stability. Subway entrances overflow with crowds that no longer move with purpose, but with frustration. Street vendors hustle under the shadow of buildings whose glossy facades no longer match the spirit on the ground. What was once a dance between chaos and order now leans noticeably toward imbalance. Even tourists who once arrived wide-eyed now move with caution, unsure of what version of New York they will encounter on any given block. The most striking part of this transformation is how normalized it has become. What would have once sparked public outrage is now treated as just another part of the urban landscape. People hurry past scenes they never would have ignored years ago. Complaints have turned into resignation. Hope has turned into habit. And beneath all of this, a deeper truth emerges. A city can only absorb so much pressure before the cracks become part of its identity. Yet this is only one layer of the unraveling. The streets reflect the surface, but the real shift becomes even clearer when you look at how the world outside sees New York today. The perception of the city is changing in ways that reveal far more than local frustration. It exposes the beginning of a global withdrawal. Beyond the daily friction felt on the streets, something even more revealing is happening. From the outside looking in, the global perception of New York, once one of the city's greatest assets, is quietly deteriorating in ways that locals rarely notice but the world can no longer ignore. For decades, international visitors saw New York as a symbol of possibility, a destination that represented ambition, culture, and the idea that America still held a certain promise. But today, when foreign travelers talk about the city, the tone has shifted. Curiosity has been replaced by caution, and admiration replaced by hesitation. The numbers reflect a pattern that tells its own story. Tourist arrivals from Europe, Asia, and South America have not rebounded the way officials expected. Conversations on travel forums describe a version of New York that feels more stressful than inspiring, more chaotic than exciting. Videos circulating online show incidents on subways, aggressive panhandling in popular districts, and an overall sense of unpredictability that spreads faster than any official tourism campaign can counter. While cities like Tokyo, Paris, and Seoul have invested heavily in restoring their appeal, New York seems caught in a loop where its reputation depends on nostalgia rather than present reality. This shift in perception carries weight. New York has always relied on international tourism not just for revenue but for identity. The city's status as a global hub was reinforced each time someone flew across an ocean simply to experience what only New York could offer. But when visitors begin framing the city as less safe, less clean, and less welcoming than alternatives, the emotional bond weakens. Travelers now compare the cost of visiting New York to the perceived value they receive, and increasingly, the equation does not justify the effort. For many, the city no longer represents a dream, but a risk. Even first-time visitors sense something different. Instead of being greeted by the electric charm they see in movies, they encounter a city struggling to hide its frayed edges. The iconic landmarks are still there, but the atmosphere around them has changed. Crowds move with a defensive posture. Public spaces lack the ease they once had. And as these impressions spread through social networks and personal recommendations, the decline becomes self-reinforcing. The fewer tourists who come, the fewer there are to generate the lively energy that once defined the city. The absence becomes noticeable in the very places that used to showcase its vitality. What makes this transformation so important is what it reveals about New York's internal structure. Tourism is often the first indicator of a deeper shift. The early sign that a city beloved by the world is beginning to lose its balance. When visitors hesitate, it signals that something fundamental is out of alignment. And understanding that misalignment becomes even clearer when you look past the image and into the infrastructure holding the city together, where the most visible cracks begin to shape a new, unsettling narrative. If the decline in global perception reveals the emotional distance forming between the city and the world, the state of its infrastructure exposes a much harsher truth. The systems that once defined the strength of American urban engineering are now showing signs of exhaustion that can no longer be dismissed as temporary setbacks. Every city ages, but not every city ages unevenly, and the inconsistencies found in the most essential structures highlight a deeper imbalance that has been ignored for far too long. What used to represent progress now feels like a warning. You can sense it the moment you step into the public transportation system. The platforms tremble slightly in ways they did not years ago. Delays are frequent enough that people barely react. Outdated ventilation systems circulate air that feels heavy and stagnant. Aging machinery groans through every movement, revealing the strain of decades without meaningful modernization. And while officials insist that repairs are always underway, the visible gaps tell another story. Temporary fixes have replaced long-term solutions, layering instability on instability until even the daily commute feels like an act of endurance rather than mobility. The streets above reflect the same pattern. Potholes linger for months, not days. Flooding occurs after ordinary rain, overwhelming drains that were never designed for the environmental pressures of today. Bridges show signs of fatigue that residents prefer not to think about. Electrical grids strain during heat waves. Water systems face contamination scares more often than anyone is comfortable admitting. It is not one catastrophic failure that defines the decline, but the accumulation of countless small breakdowns that signal a system stretched beyond its limits. The most revealing part of this collapse is the mismatch between image and reality. Promotional campaigns still present the city as a beacon of innovation, but the physical experience contradicts that narrative. Visitors expecting a modern, efficient urban environment often arrive shocked at how dated and fragile everything feels. Residents, meanwhile, have grown accustomed to improvising around the dysfunction, adjusting their routines and expectations in ways that gradually normalize the abnormal. What was once a temporary inconvenience has become a permanent backdrop to daily life. Underneath all of this lies sobering question: how long can a city sustain its global reputation when its own foundation is visibly deteriorating? Infrastructure is not just a functional component of urban life. It is the skeleton that determines how a city breathes, moves, and survives. When that skeleton begins to bend under the weight of neglect, the entire organism suffers. And whether people acknowledge it or not, the decline is already influencing how communities interact, how businesses operate, and how the future is quietly being shaped. If you have witnessed any part of this structural decay yourself, share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes the most revealing details come from personal experience, and your perspective adds depth to everything we explore here, connecting directly with what comes next in this unfolding picture. As the city's structural weaknesses become more visible, the consequences spill directly into the routines of ordinary people. Daily life in New York has become a complex negotiation, shaped less by personal choice and more by the limitations imposed by systems that no longer function as they once did. What used to be predictable parts of urban living now carry a sense of uncertainty that influences everything from how people plan their mornings to how they move through their evenings. The routines that define the city's rhythm have been disrupted, replaced by a cycle of adjustments that gradually erodes the sense of stability residents once relied on. You can see this shift most clearly in the basic services people expect any modern city to provide. Waiting for medical appointments has turned into a test of patience, with understaffed clinics stretched beyond their capacity. Emergency responses take longer than they should, leaving neighborhoods feeling exposed during situations that demand immediacy. Even the simple act of mailing a package or receiving one feels slower, less reliable, as logistical networks strain under demand they were not prepared to handle. These are not dramatic failures, but they accumulate into a daily fatigue that wears down the confidence of those who depend on these systems to function smoothly. Public cleanliness, long considered a baseline expectation, has also become inconsistent. Trash collection schedules fluctuate, creating piles that linger on sidewalks long after they should have been cleared. Rodent sightings, once a late-night stereotype, now occur in broad daylight. Residents step around overflowing bins and scatter debris, adjusting their paths through familiar streets as if navigating a temporary crisis that never ends. Each of these disruptions may seem minor on its own, but together they generate a subtle message that the city can no longer keep pace with its own demands. The emotional impact of these changes is just as significant as the practical one. People find themselves budgeting extra time for everything, preparing for delays, setbacks, or obstacles that used to be rare. The mental load of anticipating dysfunction becomes part of the routine. What was once an environment defined by ambition now feels shaped by caution. Even newcomers, who arrived expecting to be energized by the city's intensity, often express surprise at how much effort it takes to accomplish simple tasks. And longtime residents, who once celebrated the challenges of city life as part of its character, increasingly describe their days as draining rather than invigorating. This shift in everyday reality reveals a deeper transformation. A city's identity is not just built on skyscrapers or iconic avenues. It is built on the invisible systems that make life livable. When those systems falter, the psychological foundation of the city weakens. People begin to reconsider their long-term plans, their sense of belonging, and their willingness to endure the growing list of inconveniences. That subtle internal questioning, repeated across millions of individuals, becomes a powerful indicator of change. And as this quiet reevaluation spreads, it sets the stage for a much larger reckoning with the true cost of staying in a place that demands more energy than it returns. A cost that becomes even clearer when you look at the economic pressures shaping every decision residents make. The weight of daily inconvenience becomes even heavier when placed against the financial reality shaping life in the city. Every resident feels it, regardless of neighborhood, income, or lifestyle. What once was considered expensive has evolved into something closer to unsustainable, where the cost of simply existing overshadows the benefits that once justified the sacrifice. People are not just paying for housing or transportation. They are paying for the privilege of enduring a system that demands more each year while offering less in return. The balance that kept the city functioning for decades has tilted so dramatically that even long-term residents question how the equation still makes sense. Housing remains the biggest pressure point, not because it is merely costly, but because it defies logic. Rent does not reflect the quality of the buildings, nor the reliability of the surrounding services. People spend half their income on apartments with leaking ceilings, malfunctioning elevators, or heating systems that fail during the coldest nights. Maintenance requests turn into long waiting periods, and tenants adapt to conditions that would have been unacceptable in any other major city. Even those willing to compromise on comfort find themselves struggling to justify the monthly payments that continue rising without explanation or improvement. Beyond housing, the everyday cost of living magnifies the strain. Groceries fluctuate unpredictably, making a simple list feel like a financial gamble. Eating out, once a cultural staple of city life, has become a luxury reserved for rare occasions. Childcare drains families before they even consider saving for the future. Transportation, once a relatively affordable part of urban mobility, now feels like another recurring burden with no guarantee of reliability. And while wages inch forward, they never come close to matching the escalating expenses that define each passing year. The emotional toll of this financial pressure is difficult to ignore. Residents begin adjusting their expectations, not because they want to, but because they must. People work longer hours, take on additional jobs, or cut back on essentials just to stay afloat. The sense of opportunity that once fueled the city's appeal is slowly replaced by exhaustion. Ambition still exists, but it competes with the constant fear of falling behind. Even those who appear stable feel the tension beneath the surface, knowing that one unexpected bill, one job disruption, or one medical issue could unravel everything they worked so hard to maintain. This gradual erosion of economic stability reveals something deeper about the city's current trajectory. A place that once drew people with the promise of upward mobility now demands resilience simply to stand still. The cost of staying has begun to overshadow the value of the experience. And as this imbalance becomes more visible, it opens space for a more troubling transformation. One rooted not just in finances, but in the social fabric that holds communities together. As the economic strain tightens its grip, the social fabric of the city begins to show its own fractures. It is not a sudden collapse, but a gradual loosening of the invisible threads that once held different groups, neighborhoods, and identities together. For generations, the city thrived on diversity, friction, and shared purpose. Conflict existed, but there was also a sense of cohesion built through proximity, ambition, and mutual reliance. That balance has shifted. What once felt like a vibrant mosaic now feels like a fragmented landscape, where each piece struggles to maintain its shape under the pressure of widening disparities. You can witness this shift in the way people interact, or more accurately, in the way they avoid interacting. Eye contact has become rare. Conversations between strangers feel more guarded. Public space, once a stage for spontaneous connection, now carries an undercurrent of caution. People walk faster, speak less, and carve out smaller personal territories, as if the city has become too heavy to share. The social warmth that once softened the city's rough edges has cooled into a quiet defensiveness that shapes the tone of daily life. Economic inequality amplifies this tension. Luxury buildings rise beside aging complexes in states of disrepair, creating a visual reminder of the growing distance between those who can afford comfort and those who cannot. Schools reflect the same divide, as do health services, recreational spaces, and employment opportunities. Residents living only a few blocks apart inhabit entirely different versions of the city. While wealthier areas attempt to insulate themselves from the broader decline, they cannot fully escape the ripple effects spreading through the urban environment. A city cannot function in segments. Pressure in one area always finds its way into another. The emotional impact of this inequality becomes evident in the way communities respond to stress. Trust erodes. Conversations about safety become more frequent. People shift their routines not only for convenience, but for self-protection. Parents reconsider raising children in neighborhoods that once felt secure. Elderly residents retreat indoors more often. Younger adults talk openly about leaving before the environment affects their mental well-being. The collective resilience that once defined the city has fractured into individual efforts to cope with a reality that feels increasingly unpredictable. These social shifts also influence how residents perceive themselves. In a city that once offered a sense of identity and belonging, many now feel detached, as if they are living in a place that no longer reflects the values that drew them there. The tension between what the city symbolizes and what it has become creates a subtle internal conflict. People continue moving through their routines, but beneath the surface lies an awareness that something essential has changed, and not for the better. If you have felt any of these social shifts in your own experience, share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective adds depth to this conversation and helps illuminate how these changes shape the reality we continue exploring as the city evolves in ways few are willing to acknowledge. As the social atmosphere grows heavier, another shift becomes impossible to ignore, one that reveals how residents are responding to the pressures accumulating across every part of the city. The quiet reevaluation happening in living rooms, workplaces, and late-night conversations has begun to materialize in the most revealing way possible. People are leaving, not with dramatic announcements or emotional farewells, but with a steady, almost resigned acceptance that the city they once fought so hard to remain in no longer provides what they need to stay. This movement is not defined by a single demographic. It spans ages, incomes, and backgrounds, each group pushed by its own set of frustrations that eventually outweigh the reasons to hold on. The signs are visible everywhere. Apartments that would have sparked bidding wars a few years ago now sit on the market longer than expected. Families who spent decades anchored to specific neighborhoods begin packing their belongings with little fanfare. Professionals who once saw the city as a symbol of ambition now view it as a barrier to stability. Even young adults, traditionally the most enthusiastic defenders of urban life, have begun looking elsewhere for opportunity, affordability, and a sense of balance that feels increasingly out of reach. The gradual thinning of the population in key districts reflects an emotional truth people rarely say aloud: hope has limits. What makes this shift especially significant is the psychology behind the departure. People do not simply leave a place they love because of inconvenience. They leave when the emotional cost becomes heavier than the promise of staying. For many, the daily frictions that once felt tolerable now accumulate into a sense of exhaustion that cannot be ignored. The city's former allure relied on the belief that endurance would eventually lead to reward. But when the rewards begin shrinking and the obstacles keep multiplying, even the most resilient residents start questioning the value of the struggle. This exodus also reveals deeper fractures within the city's long-term prospects. When those who leave are not merely dissatisfied outsiders but deeply rooted residents, the departure becomes more than a statistic. It becomes a signal. Teachers, nurses, service workers, and essential employees relocate not because they dislike the city, but because they can no longer justify the imbalance between effort and return. Remote workers realize they do not need to remain tethered to an environment that drains them. Retirees look for calm elsewhere. Small business owners decide their energy is better invested in communities that support growth rather than resist it. The departure of these groups reshapes the city in ways that ripple far beyond the individuals leaving. Neighborhoods lose their sense of continuity. Local economies weaken as regular customers disappear. Social networks fracture as long-time connections dissolve. What remains is a thinner, less stable version of the community that once thrived on density, diversity, and interconnectedness. As more people conclude that the city no longer aligns with their future, the question becomes not just who is leaving, but what their absence reveals about the environment they leave behind. And the picture becomes even clearer when you look beyond those who move away and focus instead on those who stay, navigating a version of the city that appears increasingly unfamiliar, shaped by changes that tourists rarely see and residents know too well. Those who remain in the city face a reality that rarely appears in advertisements, travel guides, or cinematic portrayals. The polished version of urban life, crafted for tourists and promotional campaigns, exists only in selective pockets that do little to reflect the broader experience. The real daily landscape is shaped by complexities that visitors seldom understand. Tourists arrive with curated expectations, eager to see the familiar icons, but the moment they step off the usual path, they encounter an environment that reveals far more than the postcard image suggests. For residents, this contrast is not surprising. It is the difference between myth and routine, between the fantasy sold to outsiders and the truth lived by those who navigate the city every day. Beyond the bright lights and well-maintained areas prepared for public consumption, entire neighborhoods struggle with issues that rarely make national news. Streets show signs of neglect long before anyone acknowledges them. Public buildings operate under constant strain, their functionality dependent on staff who work under pressures few visitors ever notice. Many storefronts that once contributed to the vibrancy of the city now sit shuttered, victims of rising costs and decreasing foot traffic. Even cultural institutions long considered the pride of the city contend with funding shortages, declining attendance, and logistical challenges that weaken their ability to serve the public. The contrast becomes most apparent in the day-to-day interactions residents witness. Tourists may feel brief moments of discomfort, but locals see patterns emerging over months and years. They watch as untreated mental health crises unfold in public spaces. They witness conflicts on subway platforms that escalate without warning. They navigate sidewalks where unpredictability has become part of the environment. These experiences, repeated enough times, reshape the emotional relationship people have with their surroundings. What used to spark a sense of resilience now sparks caution. What once felt thrilling now feels draining. This hidden reality also shapes how residents interpret the city's identity. To outsiders, the place still appears loud, lively, and extraordinary. But to those who live there, the energy has changed. It is no longer the confident hum of a city pushing forward. It is a layered tension, a sense of imbalance that cannot be dismissed as temporary. People learn to adapt, but adaptation does not erase the underlying problems. It simply allows life to continue in an environment that demands constant vigilance. Tourists may spend a few days adjusting. Residents spend years absorbing the weight of these conditions, and eventually the contrast becomes unmistakable. Yet despite these challenges, the city continues to maintain a global reputation that seems increasingly disconnected from its internal reality. Outsiders still view it through a lens of admiration shaped by decades of cultural influence. Meanwhile, residents quietly carry the burden of navigating a place that asks more from them each year. And as this divide grows wider, a final question emerges, one that lies at the heart of the city's modern identity and forces both residents and observers to confront what the city represents, what it has become, and what it no longer is. When you look at the city through the eyes of those who live its truth rather than its legend, something becomes unmistakably clear. The divide between what the city claims to be and what it actually delivers has never been wider. The myth built over decades still floats above everything, projected in films, magazines, and conversations from people who left long ago, but speak as if nothing has changed. Yet on the ground, the lived experience reveals a place shaped by fatigue, pressured systems, and a population quietly wrestling with questions they once avoided. The idea of a limitless metropolis no longer aligns with the reality unfolding block by block. People who stay do so for reasons far more complex than outsiders assume. Some remain out of loyalty, others out of necessity, others because the thought of starting over feels heavier than the weight of staying. And yet, even among those who remain, there is a growing acknowledgement that the city no longer returns the same sense of purpose it once offered. Conversations with neighbors, co-workers, or longtime friends carry a tone of reflection, as if everyone senses they are living through a transition that has not been formally announced. The sense of pride that once united residents is now replaced with a quieter, more private calculation. Is this still worth it? The city still has pockets of brilliance, moments where the old spark breaks through the noise. But those moments feel less like a defining quality and more like fleeting reminders of what once existed. People navigate their routines with a kind of practiced endurance, aware that the symbolic power of the city continues to attract global attention even as the internal cracks deepen. The narrative of endless opportunity no longer fits the structure that supports it. And as this gap widens, more people begin to question not only the future of the city, but their place within it. This tension, felt in thousands of individual decisions, shapes the collective atmosphere that now surrounds the city. The question is no longer whether the myth has changed. It is whether the myth still serves the people who live beneath it. A city is not defined by what it advertises, but by what it sustains. And when the weight of the environment begins to overshadow the promise of possibility, the identity that once made the city extraordinary starts to dissolve into something far more fragile. You can see it in the way residents speak about the past with more certainty than the future, in the way optimism has become something people ration rather than express freely. And yet, acknowledging this shift does not erase the connection many still feel. It simply reframes it. People who stay are rewriting their expectations, redefining what it means to live in a place shaped by contradiction. They continue navigating the noise, the pressure, the unpredictability, searching for meaning within an environment that no longer guarantees it. Their stories reveal not a collapse of spirit, but a moment of clarity where illusions fade and the truth becomes unavoidable. If you reach this point, tell me in the comments by writing the phrase, "I stayed until the end." It is always powerful to see who is truly walking through this conversation with me. And if this reflection spoke to you, consider subscribing to the channel to keep exploring these deeper layers of urban life. Your support helps sustain conversations that often get lost in the noise. A like on this video also goes a long way, especially if the topic resonated with you. And if you want to continue this journey, there is another video right here that expands on this reality from a different angle. You can click and keep going, following the thread of everything we uncover together without breaking the flow.